Okay, so by way of an agenda, I'm going to look at some of the key questions that you'll need to answer when you're evaluating whether your journal is appropriate for flipping. And I've got a case study of Aging Cell, which is a journal I manage, and some of the more general pros and cons of flipping journals from different stakeholder perspectives. I'll also touch some of the support tools and modelling that will help you in your assessment of whether to flip, and then our experience of flipping journals at Wiley and what we've learned from that process. I should add to that we've actually only flipped 8 journals so far. We've got another 2 lined up for next year, and it is early days, but I can certainly share with you what we've seen with submissions and readership trends on those titles. Okay, so these are the key flip criteria. And if you're ticking the box on most of this list or all of the list, I suggest that you have actually got a good candidate for flipping. So these represent the type of journals that we've flipped. So they tend to be titles where we've got modest subscription revenues. So typically they've been young journals that haven't been able to achieve their predicted levels of subscription revenue. And when we've looked at the long-term future of the journal, we've really thought that that's in terms of growing our authorship and submissions rather than growing subscriptions. They're journals that have had a high rejection rate, at least 60% or more, and where we think there's potential to publish more in the area. And in terms of attractiveness to authors, they've tended to be journals that we think are attractive, and therefore we think that authors will pay to publish them. There's, of course, many different ways that you can measure attractiveness or value of a journal. The obvious and the elephant in the room, of course, is impact factor. And I think whilst the community is getting better at recognising the imperfections of that metric, it still does retain some currency. And they're in areas where there's evidence of good OA funding, and particularly where we can see already a high volume of existing hybrid activity. So this is where authors are already choosing to pay to make their paper open access within your subscription journal. And they're journals where we feel confident that we can set a competitive APC with the projected number of articles and get to somewhere around the current revenues that we have under the subscription model. Okay, so just to make it a bit more real, this is a case study with Aging Cell. Aging Cell is a relatively young journal. It was launched back in 2002. Academically, it's always been very successful, but due to the timing of the launch and static library budgets, it was never able to achieve a high level of subscriptions. But saying that, aging research we knew was well funded, and we could see that the community was actually really well disposed to open access. So the flag for me on this journal, when I was assessing it last year in time for our 2014 pricing round and looking back at 2012 published articles, was that 15% of the articles already in the journal were published online open. Online Open's Wiley's open access offering, and there was a good chunk of revenue associated with that. At the same time, I was being told anecdotally by the editors that they feared that they were losing high-impact papers and authors to OA competitors. And I did some analysis on PLOS genetics, and I could very quickly see that there was a good bulk of papers with high relevance to Aging Cell that could be published in Aging Cell. And so I could see that the authors in this area were publishing in OA journals and were finding the funds to do so. As I say, it was an editorially strong journal, had an impact factor of over 6 and was categorised number 1 in its ISI category. So we felt confident that people would pay to publish in the journal. And it's also always had a very healthy submission rate. The editors were rejecting over 80% of papers, more than they wanted to do so, and there was definitely potential to publish more. So assuming you can kind of tick those boxes on those flip criteria, here are some more general pros and cons of flipping, which I would urge you to consider if you're considering a specific title, because of course these things vary per journal and per subject area. So from a publisher perspective, of course, flipping might well offer you the potential to grow faster than you might otherwise be able to do if you were to stay under the subscription model. But of course, there is then some higher volatility of those revenues. You are very much dependent on those articles coming through. From a society's perspective, as Phil was talking about, it gives a society an opportunity to explore open access, and that can be very attractive to some of our societies, particularly if they've got a suite of journals. But again, the con of that is there's risk commercially and indeed editorially. In terms of the funders, some funders actually prefer fully open access journals over hybrid. The other side of that is that if you're a funder and your grantee wants to publish in your flipped journal, gold then is the only route, and there isn't a green option with embargo period. And from an institution's point of view, yep, your flipped journal doesn't have any subscription fee anymore, great, but we are seeing high costs associated with the administration of APC processing and the burden that comes with that in tracking mandates, and indeed might cost more. From an editor perspective, you might be keen on flipping if you think it gives you potential to publish more, and once you get rid of the page budget restrictions. The reality might be that you see an impact on submissions post-flip, and I'll come back to that in a moment. From an author perspective, we know there can be a feel-good feeling associated with publishing open access. The reality is, where do you get your hands on the money? And of course, like the institutions, there is a burden associated with going through the payment and the licensing associated with APCs. And finally, from the reader perspective, of course, there's no barrier to access in terms of articles behind a paywall, but there is some perception still in some parties of OA journals as indicating a lower quality. So in terms of tools and modelling, I won't go into too much detail. These are Wiley specific, really, but we do have flow charts and decision trees that allow individual publishing managers to assess if they're going to be able to get the right number of submissions through to publish a target number of articles and target revenues. And also, if your plan is to open up your newly flipped open access journal to accept papers cascaded in from other supporter journals, we have a reject analysis calculator, which again allows you to plug in the number of potential rejectors from your pool of supporter journals and estimate how many of those might go on to be published in your journal. And that uses some assumptions that we've seen across our other cascaded journals with regard to the percentages of authors that choose to transfer between journals. We also have tools, of course, that allow a financial comparison side by side between your two models. So these are our flipped journals. As I say, there's 8 of them, and they're laid out there in the order that they flipped. So we had evolutionary applications in Embo molecular medicine back in 2012. We had 3 last year, microbial biotechnology, JCMM, and influenza. And then we've had 3 this year, aging cell, as I say, along with cancer science and JDI. And we've got 2 lined up already for next year. So just going back to Embo molecular medicine, it was one of our early flips and a successful one at that. So it ticked the criteria that I talked about, in that it was a young journal launched in 2009 and had modest subscription revenues, and there was certainly some society concern about visibility of the articles behind the paywall. It had a high rejection rate of 85%. And prior to the flip, there was already a publication charge of 125 euros per page. It worked out about an average of 1,600 euros to publish in the journal. And so introducing an APC actually wasn't such a big jump for authors used to publishing in the journal. We'd also predicted a big increase in impact factor, and that came through just a couple of months after the flip, which I'm sure helped boost submissions. And so the APC was set at 3,000 euros. The Society have another open access journal with an APC at the same level, and so felt confident at setting it there, and that actually that APC was a fraction of the cost of research being published in the journal. So you can see here what happened to submissions in the year immediately prior to the flip. There were 588 submissions, and in the same period, in the year after the flip, 1,171. So the submissions actually doubled in that period. In terms of submission trends on the other journals, then Embo, as I say, saw an increase, but the other titles, EVA, MBT, JCMM, all saw dips actually in submissions immediately post-flip. They're recovering now. And I think the other four are probably too early to draw any conclusions, but I think it's safe to say that generally we do see a dip in submissions in that first year, and we would model for that going forward. Conversely, for readership, we saw readership and downloads for all of our flip titles grow to varying degrees, as you can see here. I think that's for a variety of reasons, probably in large part due to the type of journals that we chose to flip that had low subscription bases. And of course, we do a large marketing push around the time of the flip as well. So in terms of doing your modelling, these are some key points that I would urge you to consider. They're all things that get easily missed, and I've seen being missed. So really look at the volume of your potential waivers and discounts. So this is potentially if you're having commission papers or non-original research. So for example, reviews, commentaries, editorials, papers that you might have to waive the APC on. Look at whether you're going to offer an editorial board waiver, if you have discounts for funders, institutions, on submissions from developing world countries. These can soon add up. Also look at the potential revenues if your page budget restraints are removed. So not only looking at what you're publishing now, but what you might publish in the future. Look at the potential impact of exchange rate movement. Sounds obvious, but something that has been missed in the past. And also look at your non-subscription revenues and weigh those against future APC revenues. So I'm thinking here of things like submission, page charges, any income you get from colour, and assess the impact of that change for authors. Determine your non-payment assumptions. There's always people that don't pay, and also your policy around that. So do you publish straight away and get some good publication times, or do you wait till your money's in your pocket before you publish? You need to factor in any pricing adjustments under the subscription model, particularly if you've got a lot of hybrid activity, and any impact you might have there if you stay under subscription model. Consider what level of APC fits the journal and the community. APC, of course, is a feature in author choice when they're choosing where to submit, but at the same time, it needn't necessarily be a race to the bottom. And then is any potential impact of open access on any corporate sales revenue you might have currently. And then finally, what we've learnt. Plan ahead, time the communication of your decision to flip really carefully. You don't want to find yourself in a position where papers have already been submitted and are in review, or indeed in production, that then need to be published once the journal's flipped, and you have to waive those papers. Whatever you do, don't flip mid-year. Avoid it like the plague. You get into all kinds of complicated calculations around subscription reimbursements. I would always encourage undertaking submission and publication surveys. You can capture some really good feedback, particularly around the process and how you can improve that for authors. And finally, just have a really good marketing strategy for that first year and a really good communication plan, including application to any OA-specific A&I services. Okay, thank you.